The twisted ironwork of the Sittang railway bridge glowed orange in the pre-dawn darkness. At 5:30 on the morning of February 23, 1942, the spans were packed with retreating British and Indian troops. The bridge was over 1,600 feet long. It crossed a river that was deep, fast-flowing and treacherous. The monsoon was still months away, but the dry season current was already strong enough to drown a man in full kit. A young Indian driver in a 3-ton lorry missed his gear. He stamped the accelerator instead of the brake. The truck swerved. It rammed the steel girders of the span and jammed solid. For 2 hours nothing moved. Behind the stalled column, Japanese machine gunners were closing in. The sappers had already wired the bridge for demolition. Their firing point was on the bridge itself because there was not enough cable to reach the West Bank. The commander on the West Bank faced an impossible choice. His name was John Smyth, a Victoria Cross winner from the First World War. He knew that much of his division was still on the far side. He also knew the Japanese would capture the bridge intact if he waited any longer. He gave the order. The explosion tore the spans apart. The twisted ironwork fell into the Sittang. Thousands of men were left behind. Over 1,400 were dead or missing. How had the defense of Burma collapsed so completely in just 5 months? That question echoed through every command headquarters from Delhi to London. The answer began on the 16th of January 1942. On that day, the Japanese invaded southern Burma from their bases in Siam. They moved fast. They moved with a confidence that stunned the British defenders. And they did not come alone. The Japanese assault force was built around the 55th Division. It struck across the border from the east. The terrain was dense jungle. The roads were little more than muddy tracks. The British had expected the Japanese to be slowed by the same terrain that had always frustrated European armies. They were wrong. The Japanese infantry moved light. They carried their own supplies. They outflanked every blocking position the British tried to establish. Alongside the Japanese troops marched a new and unexpected force. It was called the Burma Independence Army. Its soldiers were Burmese nationalists, young men who had been recruited and trained by Japanese intelligence officers in the months before the invasion. Their leader was a wiry, intense student revolutionary named Aung San. He was 27 years old. He believed the Japanese would give his country genuine independence. The man who had created this army was a Japanese colonel named Keiji Suzuki. Suzuki was a rebel by temperament and a conformist by upbringing. He was brusque, domineering, and easily provoked. But he was also intensely committed to the cause of Burmese liberation. He told the young nationalists not to beg for independence. "Proclaim it yourselves," he said. "If the Japanese refuse to give it, shoot back." William Slim was a lieutenant general commanding a corps in Iraq when the Japanese struck. He was summoned to Burma in March. He arrived to find a battlefield in chaos. The British and Indian units were scattered. Morale was shattered. The troops had been told the Japanese were inferior jungle fighters. The troops had discovered the opposite was true. Slim was a blunt, practical soldier from a Birmingham working-class family. He did not believe in excuses. The Japanese advance was relentless. They captured the port of Mulmine. They crossed the Salween River. They drove the defenders westward toward the Sittang. The British commander in Rangoon, Lieutenant General Thomas Hutton, was under intense pressure from the Supreme Commander in Java, Sir Archibald Wavell. Wavell demanded aggressive counterattacks. He believed constant withdrawal was destroying morale. He was right about the morale. He was wrong about what counterattacks could achieve. The 17th Indian Division was the only formed body of troops between the Japanese and Rangoon. Its commander was Major General John Smyth. Smyth had begged for permission to withdraw behind the Sittang River early. He wanted to blow the bridge and establish a proper defensive line. Hutton refused. Wavell was pressuring him to hold ground forward. Smyth was forced to fight on the Bilin River. The Japanese outflanked him again. Now the race for the Sittang Bridge began in earnest. The night of February 21st was hot and dry. The retreating columns stirred up thick clouds of red dust as they moved toward the bridge. Japanese planes attacked them. Then Allied planes attacked them by mistake. The bombing was catastrophic. Ambulances were destroyed. Mules vanished into the jungle carrying their loads. Men panicked and deserted. Nearly 200 men from one battalion simply walked away into the darkness. The column lost cohesion at the worst possible moment. 2 precious hours were lost freeing the vehicle. During those 2 hours, the Japanese caught up with the retreating columns. A Japanese machine gunner set up his weapon in the cutting overlooking the bridge. Any engineer trying to check the fuses had to run through his fire. The bridgehead on the east bank was overrun. Japanese infantry were now within grenade range of the spans. Smyth was on the west bank with his headquarters. He could see that the bridge was about to fall into enemy hands. With the bridge gone, most of the 17th Division was stranded on the far bank. Thousands of Indian and British troops watched their escape route vanish. Some tried to swim. The current was strong. Japanese machine gunners fired into the water. A few men managed to cross on makeshift rafts. Most did not. The division lost nearly all its equipment. The survivors who reached the west bank were shattered. They had no artillery. They had no transport. They had no anti-tank weapons. They had only their personal weapons and the clothes they wore. The 17th Indian Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The road to Rangoon lay open. The Japanese did not even pause. They simply marched north along the east bank until they found an easy ford and crossed the river higher up. The blame for the disaster fell on Smyth. Wavell accused him of pessimism and lack of fighting spirit. Smyth was a sick man by this time. He was broken and removed from command. The subsequent inquiries focused on the name confusion between two brigadiers named Jones. That was a red herring. The real fault lay in the strategic decision to hold too far forward. Smyth had warned his superiors repeatedly. They had refused to listen. The twisted ironwork in the Sittang was their monument. Rangoon was doomed. The new commander, General the Honourable Sir Harold Alexander, arrived to find the city indefensible. He ordered the port installations destroyed. He ordered the oil refineries at Syriam blown up. Thick black smoke rose over the city. The governor, Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, had already left. The civil administration collapsed. Looters roamed the streets. The police vanished. On the 7th of March, the last British troops pulled out. The Japanese entered the abandoned capital the following day. Dorman Smith had governed Burma for less than a year. He had been sent out in 1941 to restore confidence. The war had destroyed that mission before it began. Now he watched from exile as the country fell. The collapse of British authority was total. Every institution the Raj had built over a century crumbled in a matter of weeks. The Burmese people who had fled with the British were few. Most stayed and watched the conquerors arrive. The Japanese did not come as liberators to everyone. The Indian community in Rangoon was terrified. Many of them had been the moneylenders and chettiars who owned half the agricultural land in Lower Burma. When the British left, they had no protection. Tens of thousands fled toward India on foot. The roads north became rivers of refugees. Cholera broke out in the columns. The dead were left by the roadside. The vultures attended them. Alexander's task was to save what remained of the Burma army. He conducted a fighting retreat up the Irrawaddy Valley. The Chinese expeditionary force under the American general Joseph Stilwell was supposed to hold the eastern flank. The Chinese were badly led and badly supplied. They collapsed almost as fast as the British. Stilwell himself was cut off. He walked out through the jungle with a small party of American and Chinese officers. He was deeply embittered by the experience. Slim took command of the rearguard. He fought a series of delaying actions at Moniwa and along the Chindwin River. The Japanese were everywhere. Slim's force was constantly at risk of being cut off. He stayed calm. He issued clear, simple orders. His men began to trust him. There was something in his deliberate, unflustered manner that suggested the retreat was a temporary setback. The men needed that belief. They were exhausted, sick, and ashamed. The retreat finally ended in May. The monsoon broke. The skies opened. The rivers rose. The roads dissolved into mud. The Japanese advance stopped at the Chindwin River. They had achieved their objective. Burma was theirs. But the rains made further pursuit impossible. The remnants of the British and Indian forces staggered into the hills of Assam. They were emaciated. They had lost their equipment. They had lost their pride. But the army had survived. Slim began the long work of rebuilding it. On the Burmese side, the Japanese had already begun to alienate their new subjects. The Burma Independence Army had behaved like a gang of armed thugs in the Delta. There were massacres of Karen villagers. Suzuki took the side of the Burmans in these racial conflicts. The Japanese High Command was appalled. They purged the Independence Army. They recalled Suzuki to Tokyo. Aung San was left to lead a reduced force under tight Japanese supervision. The promises of genuine liberation were already souring. The Chindwin River became the front line. Across its muddy waters, two exhausted armies faced each other through the monsoon months. In India, the British began to plan their return. In Rangoon, the Japanese installed a puppet government and began to exploit the country they had conquered. Neither side knew it yet, but the campaign for Burma had only just begun. The twisted spans of the Sittang Bridge lay rusting in the current. They would remain there, a silent reminder of the longest retreat, for years to come. In the monsoon months of 1942, the Chindwin River was a barrier of mud and swirling water. Across that river, the Japanese had halted, their supply lines stretched to breaking. On the Indian side, a shattered army caught its breath. Slim gathered the remnants of regiments and brigades in the steaming hills of Assam. He walked the camps, spoke quietly to exhausted men, and began the slow, grinding work of rebuilding a fighting army from the wreckage of defeat. The old formulas had failed. New ones would have to be forged in the jungle itself. That rebuilding started with the basics: malaria discipline, resupply by air, and tactical training that treated the jungle not as a barrier, but as a path. Slim insisted on aggressive patrolling. British and Indian troops, who had once clung to roads, were sent deep into the green wilderness to hunt Japanese patrols. The psychological tide began to turn. The Japanese were no longer invisible demons of the forest. They were men who bled and died. Across the front, a new confidence began to stir, but it was far from universal. In the coastal province of Arakan, a more conventional offensive was grinding forward, and it was not going well. Ord Wingate was a brigadier with a prophet's beard and a burning, unorthodox vision. He did not believe in roads. He did not believe in supply lines that ran through predictable corridors. He believed in penetrating deep behind enemy lines with columns supplied entirely by air, living off the jungle and striking at the Japanese lines of communication. His doctrine was built around what he called long-range penetration, and he had found a powerful advocate in Prime Minister Churchill. By early 1943, Wingate was in Assam, assembling a brigade of British, Gurkha, and Burmese troops. He gave them a name drawn from Burmese mythology, the Chindits, after the mythical lion that guards the pagodas. Their symbol was a snarling golden beast, and their mission was to march toward the Chindwin and then vanish into the jungle. On the night of February 13, 1943, the first Chindit column crossed the Chindwin River. The men moved in single file, leading thousands of mules laden with radios, mortars, and 70-pound packs. Wingate's map was a patchwork of uncertain tracks, marked with the Chinthi symbol, a promise of chaos to be delivered behind the enemy's lines. They had no heavy artillery. They had no secure rear area. Their lifeline was the Dakota transport aircraft and the wireless set. The operation was an act of supreme faith in the new gospel of air supply. The columns dispersed and began cutting railway lines, ambushing Japanese outposts, and disappearing back into the jungle before the enemy could concentrate. For weeks, they spread disruption across the Japanese rear areas, blowing bridges and ambushing patrols. The Japanese high command was caught off guard. They had not believed such a deep penetration was possible. The cost, however, was savage. The jungle was not neutral. It was a furnace of heat, leeches, and disease. Men collapsed from cerebral malaria and scrub typhus. The mules died in droves, the columns were constantly hunted by Japanese forces, and Wingate's tactical genius could not shield them from the brutal arithmetic of exhaustion. By the time the exhausted columns finally reached India again, nearly a third of the force was dead or missing. The survivors were gaunt and hollow-eyed, yet the strategic effect was profound. The first Chindit expedition proved that a British force could not merely survive, but operate deep inside Japanese-held territory. The myth of jungle invincibility was cracked. Slim studied the results with a professional's quiet intensity. He saw the flaws, the wasteful attrition. He also saw the future of mobile warfare in Burma. While Wingate's columns were buried in the jungle, a different kind of battle was unfolding in the Arakan. The coastal offensive was an old-fashioned effort, moving slowly forward with conventional infantry and artillery along the narrow coastal plain. It was conceived before the lessons of the retreat had been fully absorbed. Lieutenant General Irwin pushed his brigades forward against deeply entrenched Japanese bunkers. The bunkers were made of massive teak logs and earth, invisible in the jungle, and impervious to anything but a direct hit from a heavy shell. The British and Indian troops lacked the tanks and heavy artillery to break them. They launched assault after assault, each one a bloody failure. At a place called Dombaik, the attack shattered against a wall of concealed machine gun fire. At Indin, in April 1943, Brigadier Cavendish was killed, leading a desperate charge against the bunkers, and his brigade was routed. The Japanese would sally out at night, infiltrating through the jungle to cut off forward companies. Panic was contagious. Units that had been reconstituted after the Sittang Bridge disaster dissolved again under the pressure of defeat. The Arakan offensive had become a graveyard of hopes. It exposed a deep crisis in British command. Irwin was seen as distant, ineffective, a man who blamed his subordinates for failures that were systemic. In May, he was replaced by General Gifford, a steadier hand. The failure in Arakan was a bitter medicine. It confirmed that traditional set-piece tactics were suicidal in the Burma jungle. The Japanese were masters of the envelopment, using the jungle to bypass strongpoints and attack from the rear. The British had to learn to hold ground in all-round boxes, supplied by air, and to counter-attack with tanks. These painful lessons would be codified in the months that followed. They would become the doctrine that Slim hammered into his corps and divisions. But to the outside world, and to the strategists in London and Washington, the picture was grim. Burma appeared to be a theatre where the Japanese could not be beaten, a swamp of failure that swallowed divisions whole. While the British struggled in the jungle, the political architecture of wartime Burma was being remade. In Singapore, a new Japanese commander was appointed to lead the 15th Army. His name was Mutaguchi Renya. Mutaguchi was ambitious, aggressive, and a fervent believer in the Imperial Army's destiny. He had been instrumental in the capture of Singapore. Now he turned his eyes toward India. He began conceiving a vast offensive that would seize the British base at Imphal and unleash a revolt against the Raj. The plans were grandiose, the logistical calculations wildly optimistic, but Mutaguchi's confidence was unshakable. He was a force of nature, and his presence would soon be felt across the entire theatre. In Rangoon, the Japanese were attempting to solidify their rule through politics. On August 1, 1943, they granted nominal independence to Burma. The new state was headed by Ba Maw, a suave and ambitious lawyer who had been the country's first premier under the British. Ba Maw proclaimed the birth of a free Burma, adopting the trappings of a totalitarian leader, a single party, a single voice, a single command. He spoke of Asian blood and the liberation of the continent from white rule. It was a performance designed to win the loyalty of the Burmese people and to convince the outside world that the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was a reality. But behind the pageantry, the reality was hollow. The Japanese army still controlled the economy, the security apparatus, and all military decisions. The independence was a gilded cage. Aung San sat in the cabinet as the defense minister. He wore the uniform of a major general in the newly renamed Burma National Army, a force formed from the purged remnants of the old Burma Independence Army. His public posture was one of cooperation. But behind his steady, penetrating gaze, a profound disenchantment was growing. The Japanese had recalled his mentor, Colonel Suzuki. They had stripped the army of its autonomy, and they had not delivered genuine independence. San was a patriot, fiercely devoted to the ideal of a truly free Burma. He was no one's puppet. Secretly, he began to reach out. Through intermediaries, he made contact with the communists and with the Karen underground. Quietly, tentatively, the first threads of an anti-Japanese resistance were being spun. San was waiting, watching and planning, for the moment when he could turn his army against its supposed allies. The news of Burma's independence was received with deep skepticism by the Thakin nationalists. The young revolutionaries who had once flocked to Suzuki's banner now saw the Japanese as colonial masters in all but name. The brutal behavior of the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, had alienated the population. The economy was in freefall, the promises of the co-prosperity sphere had turned to ashes. Among the Thakins, a secret group was forming, calling itself the Anti-Fascist Organization. It was a loose coalition of communists, socialists and nationalists, united by a single burning goal, to throw the Japanese out of Burma. Its existence was unknown to the Japanese High Command. Its leader was Aung San. The political ground beneath the Japanese occupation was shifting, and the cracks were beginning to show, even as the military forces were preparing for their most ambitious operation of the war. In India, the strategic command structure was also being reshuffled. A new supreme commander was appointed for the Southeast Asia theatre. His name was Louis Mountbatten, a cousin of the king and a naval officer of immense energy and charm. Mountbatten was not a soldier by training, but he was a natural diplomat and a fierce advocate for his command. He arrived in Ceylon to a headquarters that was fractious and under-resourced. His mission was to breathe new life into a dead strategy. The Americans wanted action in North Burma to open a road to China. The British wanted to reconquer their lost empire. These goals were not the same, and the tension between them would dominate the theatre for the next 2 years. Mountbatten's first job was to forge a coherent plan from the wreckage of the Arakan failure and the flickering hope of the Chindits. Slim, now commanding XV Corps in Imphal, watched the strategic deliberations with a professional's detachment. He knew that the real war would be fought in the jungle, not in conference rooms. He continued to train his men relentlessly. He studied the lessons of the first Chindit expedition. He absorbed the bitter experience of Arakan. His philosophy was simple: the Japanese were not supermen, and the jungle was not impenetrable. The key was logistics. If you could supply your troops by air, you could stand anywhere, fight anywhere. This was the lesson that would transform the Burma Campaign. The monsoon of 1943 was ending. The roads were drying. Across the Chindwin, the Japanese were stirring. A storm was gathering, and its name was Imphal. The first tentative counterstrokes had ended. The Chindits had proved that the Japanese did not own the jungle, but at a terrible human cost. The Arakan offensive had collapsed in a welter of blood and recrimination. And in Rangoon, the Japanese had erected a fragile puppet state, its hollow independence a mask for military occupation. Yet beneath the surface, the balance was shifting. The British and Indian armies were learning, adapting, and rebuilding. The Burmese nationalists, led by Aung San, were nursing a secret fire of resistance. And high in the hills of Assam, a general named Slim was preparing a trap. The first blows had been struck. The real battle was yet to come. The general paced in front of a map, pinned to the wall of his Singapore headquarters. It was September 1943. Mutaguchi Renya had arrived with a reputation. He was the man who had seized Singapore, a commander of ferocious energy and vaulting ambition. Now, as commander of the Japanese 15th Army, his gaze swept across the blue line of the Chindwin River toward the brown hills of Manipur and Assam. His staff watched him in silence. He did not see a frontier. He saw a gateway. The monsoon had ended. Across the river, a British army was rebuilding. The great gamble of the previous year, the first Chindit expedition, had proved the jungle could be penetrated. Mutaguchi consumed the reports with hungry eyes. The Chindits had walked through, supplied by air. If irregulars could do it, why not a full army? He slapped the map hard. Imphal would fall. Then, with the gateway to India open, the subcontinent would rise. British intelligence listened. They called the looming shadow Operation You Go. In Rangoon, the political atmosphere was thickening into something treacherous. Aung San sat in his office at the Defense Ministry. He was a major general at 28. On his uniform, a Japanese sword hung at his side. But his eyes were restless. The promises of a free Burma under Japan had curdled. Japanese officers barked orders at his people. The Kempe police arrested anyone who whispered dissent. The economy was a hollow shell. He had been building something else, a secret network of communists, socialists, and army officers united only by a hatred of the Japanese occupation. They called it the Anti-Fascist Organization. The young men around San pleaded for action. He calmed them with a low, measured voice. Any rising now would be smashed. The Japanese army was still too strong, coiled like a python across the land. They must wait. They must gather arms and intelligence. When the British crossed the Irrawaddy, that would be the signal. To his most trusted aides, he spoke of contacting the enemy. Through the chaos of the war, he made contact with a ghost. In the jungles of the Karen Hills, a British major lived among the tribal villagers, a guerrilla leader who had never surrendered. He shed his uniform and wore the longyi of the hill people. He ate their rice. He organized a network of informants and saboteurs. The Japanese knew a British officer was hiding in the hills. They sent punitive expeditions. They burned villages. They tortured headmen. Seagrim heard the screams from the jungle. The choice crystallized in his mind with terrible clarity. He would give himself up. His sacrifice would be reported to a clandestine British unit, Force 136, which was coordinating guerrilla resistance behind Japanese lines. In September 1944, a Karen runner brought the news to Force 136 in India that Seagrim had walked into a Japanese camp and surrendered months earlier. In Rangoon's Insign Gaol, the military interrogators faced a calm, towering Englishman. He asked only that the Karens be spared. He had committed no crime, he said. He was a soldier obeying orders. The court-martial sentenced him to death by firing squad. On the 2nd of September 1944, he was taken to Kemmendine Cemetery, blindfolded, and shot. His sacrifice burned like a pilot light in the hills, waiting for the British to come back. The strategic duel was now fully joined. Mountbatten, from his headquarters in Kandy, Ceylon, pushed for an amphibious hook to take Rangoon. But in London, Churchill demanded the retention of landing craft for Italy. The deep blueprints for a seaborne invasion gathered dust. In the Central Front, the real war would be shaped by mud, air supply, and the will of a single Japanese general. Mutaguchi had no landing craft. His plan was a thunderbolt delivered by jungle tracks and naked aggression. His staff gathered around a vast table in Maimyo. The Chief of Staff, Major General Kunimura, was a burly man with a fondness for geisha. The senior staff officer, Colonel Kinoshita, was a meticulous planner. Mutaguchi's eyes blazed as he outlined the concept. 3 divisions would cross the Chindwin. The 33rd would smash into the Tiddim front. The 15th would hook around from the north. The 31st would drive deep to seize Kohima, cutting the road to Dimapur and throttling the British supply line. The target was not just territory. The target was India's political will. The Japanese high command in Tokyo was uneasy. General Kawabe, commanding the Burma Area Army, harbored deep reservations. His staff produced logistics tables that showed the impossible. The army would need to move 60,000 tons of supplies through jungle tracks. Mutaguchi waved the figures away. He would capture British dumps. He would ride on the energy of victory. In a tense conference, his belligerence pounded the senior generals into silence. The order was given. Operation U-Go would launch on the 15th of March 1944 at Imphal. General Slim was ready. His defensive plan was unorthodox. He would not cling to forward positions. He would let the Japanese batter themselves against a series of prepared boxes, Bishanpur, Shenam, Palel. The key terrain was the plain around Imphal itself, where his transport squadrons could land. If the Japanese cut the Kohima road, the Dakotas would fly over them. His men would fight surrounded, but never cut off. He ordered the 17th Indian Division to place a blocking force at Tiddim, then pull back slowly, drawing the enemy in. The Japanese storm broke on the night of the 15th. The 33rd Division, under General Yanagida, surged across the Manipur River. They had no tanks, no heavy artillery beyond what mules could carry, but they moved faster than the British believed possible. Patrols vanished. Outposts were overrun. Slim's plan was already starting to crack. Yanagida's men were not cooperating with Mutaguchi's timetable. They were obsessed with a smaller target, the town of Tongzang. They paused. Mutaguchi's rage was volcanic. The real danger, however, was forming to the north. The Japanese 31st Division under General Sato was marching with grim speed through the Naga Hills. His men carried 50 pounds each, rice, ammunition, and a heart full of fatalism. Sato did not believe in the offensive. The terrain was a vertical hell of razor-backed ridges and leech-infested valleys, but his soldiers were the men of the snow country. They climbed. They did not stop. They emerged from the jungle before a small, vital hill station, Kohima. The garrison at Kohima was a scratch force. The Assam Regiment, half-trained and half-armed, manned the jungle-covered slopes. The 4th Royal West Kents had just arrived from the baking plains. Their commander, Colonel Laverty, looked at the steep ridgeline and knew they were outnumbered. The Japanese attacked on the 4th of April. They seized the heights. They cut the road to Dimapur. The little garrison was surrounded. The battle for the tennis court began. The court was a flat rectangle of beaten earth beside the district commissioner's bungalow. On one side, the West Kents dug in behind sandbags. On the other, the Japanese grenadiers crouched in the smashed flower beds. The distance was 20 yards. For 2 weeks they fought with grenades, bayonets, and shovels. The wounded lay in the open, screaming for water. The stench of rotting bodies hung in the damp air. Colonel Laverty was shot dead on the terrace. The men fought on. Inside the bungalow, the scene was a charnel house. The Japanese had dug tunnels under the floor. At night, you could hear them scraping beneath your feet. A sergeant of the West Kents, remembered only as Waterhouse, crawled forward with a Bangalore torpedo, an explosive-filled tube for clearing wire, and blew in a Japanese position. The blast hurled him back. He got up, his face blackened, and went back for more ammunition. The garrison lived on biscuits and tea brewed in petrol tins. The water was red with rust. The relief came on the 18th of April. Tanks of the 2nd Division smashed up the winding road from Dimapur. The leading company of the Royal Norfolks charged through the shattered gate. They found the tennis courts strewn with Japanese dead. The survivors of the West Kents were skeletons with hollow eyes. They had held the Japanese 31st Division, bleeding and starving, pulled back into the hills. But the siege of Kohima was only the outer ring. The main battle still raged at Imphal. While the infantry clawed at each other in the mud, a different kind of war was being fought in the deep jungle. Wingate had launched his second Chindit expedition on the 5th of March. This time, he had an entire division, 5 brigades, and a fleet of American gliders and Dakotas. The columns flew in at night, landing in clearings hacked out of the teak forests. The operation was massive. It was also chaotic. Gliders crashed into trees. Columns lost contact. Wingate, now a major general, was everywhere, his prophet's beard jutting, his eyes blazing with fever and vision. On the 24th of March, he boarded a B-25 Mitchell bomber at an airstrip in Assam. He was flying to a forward base to sort out the tangled command. The weather was vicious. A pre-monsoon thunderstorm raked the ridges. The pilot climbed through the murk. The aircraft hit a wall of cloud. It struck a jungle ridge at full speed. There were no survivors. Wingate, his staff, and the crew were torn to pieces among the shattered trees. The news hit London like a physical blow. Churchill mourned the loss of a man he called a spark of genius. The command passed to Brigadier Lentaigne. The decision was resented by some of Wingate's most aggressive column commanders. They had been forged in the fire of his personality. Without him, the purpose of the operation seemed to drain away. The brigades continued to fight, blowing bridges, ambushing supply columns, but their losses mounted. The cost in dead and sick was 40%. By August, they were pulled out. The Chindits had not stopped the Japanese offensive. That was done by the mud and the supply drops over the Imphal plain. By July, Mutaguchi's offensive was a corpse walking. The British had air superiority. Dakotas and commandos droned over the hills daily, dropping ammunition, food, and mail. The Japanese supply columns were annihilated on the roads by fighter bombers. The 15th Division had been shattered at Bishampur. The 33rd Division was stalled before Palel. The men of the 31st, retreating from Kohima, were eating grass, snails, and the rotting carcasses of mules. Mutaguchi refused to hear the word retreat. He sacked 3 divisional commanders. He ordered a final banzai charge. It was a slaughter. On the Shenam Saddle, the battle was fought in a landscape of stripped trees and blackened earth. Major General Yamamoto led his infantry group forward. The British artillery and tanks met them with concentrated fire. The charge broke. The dead lay piled in the ravines. Yamamoto and his staff committed suicide. Further south on the Tiddim Road, a battalion of the 15th Division was caught in the open by fighters. 300 men died in 5 minutes. The survivors scattered into the jungle. The retreat that followed was a horror. Slim ordered his men to pursue. The road from Palel to the Chindwin became one of the skeleton roads of the Japanese Empire. The sick and wounded were left behind on the verges. Thousands of unburied bodies marked the track like milestones. The monsoon lashed the skeletal survivors with sheets of rain. Wild dogs fed on the dead. The river, when they reached it, was in spate, a churning wall of brown water. Men who could not swim clung to logs and were swept away. Mutaguchi, raving and stricken, was carried to the east bank by his staff. The numbers were staggering. The Japanese had fed over 85,000 men into the assault. 53,000 were dead, missing, or so sick they would never fight again. It was the worst land defeat in Japanese military history. The myth of jungle invincibility was shattered. Slim stood in his headquarters in Imphal, a quiet man with a bulldog face, reading the casualty returns. He felt no exultation. He knew what his men had paid. He also knew what it meant. The road to Burma was open. The scandal in Tokyo consumed the survivors. Mutaguchi was sacked. His protector, the powerful General Kawabe, was sidelined. To replace him, the High Command sent Lieutenant General Hyotaro Kimura, a ruthless disciplinarian with a record of command in the field. Kimura arrived in Rangoon in late August to find a shattered army. He began to rebuild, but the sickness eating at the Japanese cause in Burma was not just military, it was political. In the capital, a nervous puppet prime minister named Ba Maw had nearly been killed by his own supposed allies, and the would-be assassin was a geography professor with a poisoned mind. In the autumn of 1944, Slim's 14th Army stood poised on the Chindwin River. The monsoon had ended. The roads were drying. Behind him lay the graves of 53,000 Japanese soldiers scattered along skeleton roads from Imphal to the jungle. Ahead lay the Irrawaddy, Mandalay, and the heart of Burma. Kimura had spent the autumn rebuilding the shattered Japanese Burma area army, pulling in reinforcements from Thailand and Malaya. The new commander was a ruthless disciplinarian who had no illusions about the coming storm. Kimura expected the British to attack. He could not guess where. The Irrawaddy was over 1,000 yards wide in places, a swirling barrier of brown water. Honda's 33rd Army held the eastern bank with 4 divisions dug into bunkers and trenches. Slim's plan was to deceive them. He sent a corps noisily north toward Mandalay, while the real blow fell further south, at a bend in the river called Nyaungu. The Japanese had to believe the main thrust was coming straight at the old capital. On the 10th of January 1945, the crossing began. Under cover of darkness and a massive artillery barrage, assault boats pushed into the cold Irrawaddy. Men of the 7th Indian Division paddled furiously, their faces lit by the flash of Japanese mortars. The current was treacherous. Boats capsized, men drowned in the dark. On the far bank, the leading companies scrambled up muddy bluffs and overran startled Japanese outposts. By dawn, a bridgehead was carved into enemy territory. Slim watched the reports come in from his forward headquarters. He was calm. He had rebuilt this army from the wreckage of 1942. He knew his division commanders by name and temperament. The deception was working. Japanese reserves were being drawn north toward Mandalay. At Nyaungu, engineers were already throwing a pontoon bridge across the river. Tanks and trucks began to rumble across the Irrawaddy, transforming the bridgehead into a springboard for the final campaign. The 14th Army was across the greatest river barrier in Burma. Mandalay lay less than 100 miles to the northeast. But Kimura was not broken. His main force still held strong positions south of the city. The Burma Area Army was prepared to fight a last-ditch defensive battle. Slim knew that capturing Mandalay would be a symbolic triumph, but the decisive blow would have to fall deeper, at the Japanese supply hub of Make Tila. The race was on. Through February of 1945, the 14th Army ground toward Mandalay. The city had once been the capital of the Kingdom of Ava, a place of golden pagodas and rose-red walls. Now it was a fortress. The Japanese 33rd Army fought street by street, house by house. Gurkhas and Punjabis clawed their way through the northern suburbs. Tanks of the 255th Brigade blasted bunkers with point-blank fire. The ancient palace gardens became a killing ground. Mandalay burned, the golden stupas of Mandalay Hill, already blackened by fire from the 1942 invasion, were shattered again by artillery and bombing. The great teak monasteries splintered under high explosive. Civilians huddled in cellars and air raid shelters. The stench of the dead rose from the ruins. It was a desolation of the war, which in 3 years had swept the length of the country and back again. The proud city was a heap of smouldering rubble. Kimura knew the city could not be held. He was a cold realist. He ordered his divisions to fall back southward, preserving the core of his army for a battle further down the road to Rangoon. The Japanese retreat was disciplined. They left rearguards to die in place, buying time for the main body to withdraw. When the last British bayonets cleared the rubble on the 28th of February, they found Mandalay empty of its defenders. The Burma Area Army was intact. 300 miles to the south, in Rangoon, Aung San was making his own preparations. The young Burmese commander-in-chief had secretly moved elements of his Burma National Army out of the capital, positioning them for the moment when they would turn against their Japanese patrons. His contacts with the British, painstakingly built through the anti-fascist organization and guerrilla networks in the Karen Hills, were accelerating. He was waiting for a signal. When the British crossed a line running through central Burma, the BNA would rise. The armored column moved fast through the dry scrubland, kicking up clouds of red dust that hung in the air for miles. Lee medium tanks and Stuart light tanks ground along the dirt tracks, infantry clinging to their hulls, the men scanning the tree line for ambush. By the 2nd of March, the spearhead had crossed the Irrawaddy south of Pakoku and was driving eastward over flat, open country. Slim's deception had worked. Kimura had expected a direct thrust toward Mandalay from the north. Instead, a steel fist was punching toward his soft underbelly. Japanese reconnaissance was slow to detect the movement. When the reports finally reached Kimura's headquarters, it was already too late. The tanks of the 255th Brigade roared into the outskirts of Maigtila on the 3rd of March. The town was defended by a scratch force of Japanese base troops, mechanics, signalers, and hospital orderlies. They fought with rifles and grenades from shattered buildings and hastily dug foxholes. The Lee tanks blasted them apart at close range. The infantry of the 17th Division followed through, clearing each street, each compound, each warehouse. By evening, the town was in British hands. Fires burned in the supply dumps. Ammunition exploded in orange cascades against the darkening sky. Kimura's logistical heart had been torn out. But Kimura was not a man to accept defeat. He ordered every available division to converge on Maigtila and destroy the British force holding it. The Japanese 18th Division swung down from the Shan Plateau. The 49th and 53rd Divisions, still intact after the Mandalay fighting, were thrown into the counterattack. Within days, the British garrison was encircled. The 17th Division dug in around the town. The tanks formed mobile fire brigades, dashing from one threatened sector to another, their guns cracking day and night. Japanese infantry pressed the perimeter closely. At some points, the fighting was hand-to-hand. The British wounded were treated in shattered buildings while mortars crashed down outside. The siege of Maigtila lasted through late March. Every Japanese assault broke against the defensive boxes. Dakotas droned overhead to drop ammunition and medical supplies. The tanks, though worn and battered, never stopped firing. By the final days of March, Kimura's counterattacks had spent themselves. His divisions had suffered thousands of casualties. His supply dumps were ashes. The road to Rangoon lay open. Slim received the reports at his forward headquarters with quiet satisfaction. The gamble had worked. The Japanese military machine in Burma had been shattered beyond repair. What remained was the pursuit. In Rangoon, Aung San had been quietly moving his units into position since February. Under the pretext of reinforcing the crumbling front, he pulled his Burma National Army away from Japanese supervision, waiting for the moment to strike. His underground contacts with the British had intensified, and he knew that any delay could expose his double game. The day of decision came on the 28th of March, 1945. The BNA paraded through the streets of Rangoon in full uniform, their officers wearing the insignia of Japanese major generals and colonels. They saluted the Japanese commanders, their faces expressionless. Then they marched out of the city, supposedly heading north to reinforce the crumbling Japanese front. Once clear of the suburbs, Aung San gave the order. The columns turned their weapons against the Japanese rearguard. Supply depots were seized. Japanese stragglers were shot. The Burma National Army, formed by Japanese intelligence to serve Tokyo's empire, had openly defected to the Allies. Aung San had waited 3 years for this moment. The British command received the news with a mixture of relief and deep suspicion. On the 15th of May, Aung San crossed the Irrawaddy at Alanmeo and presented himself at Slim's forward headquarters, wearing the full regalia of a Japanese major general's sword and all. He represented, he said, the army of the Provisional Government of Burma. Slim heard him out. He told Aung San bluntly that he did not need his help to defeat the Japanese. He recognized no provisional government. If Aung San wished to join the British, He would have to accept Slim's orders as a subordinate commander. The young Burmese leader was visibly disappointed. Slim was impressed by his refusal to be cowed. Then Slim raised the charge of murder. Before Aung San could speak, Slim told him that there was a well-substantiated accusation that he had personally killed a village headman in 1942. Some of the British civil affairs officers in Slim's own headquarters wanted Aung San arrested and tried. Slim asked him if he understood the risk he was taking by walking into British headquarters. Aung San replied without hesitation, no, he was not afraid, because Slim was a British officer. Slim laughed. The two men talked for a while longer. Slim judged him to be ambitious, a genuine patriot, and a well-balanced realist. He could do business with this man. Slim later reflected that arresting Aung San would have plunged Burma into civil war while the Japanese were still a threat, and he trusted the young general as a realist and patriot. The BNA was to be used, and Aung San was to be protected. The Burma National Army spread out across the rear areas of the collapsing Japanese forces. They attacked stragglers, cut supply lines, and provided intelligence to the advancing British columns. The Japanese, already reeling from the loss of Meiktila and the fall of Mandalay, found themselves stabbed in the back by the very soldiers they had trained and armed. Burmese villagers, who had endured 3 years of occupation, saw their own national army fighting alongside the British. It was a political transformation as much as a military one. Aung San, the young student revolutionary who had marched into Burma with the Japanese in 1942, had brought his army over to the winning side. Through April, Slim's 14th Army rolled southward toward Rangoon. The pace was furious. The 17th Indian Division, released from the siege of Meiktila, raced down the main road, pressing the retreating Japanese without pause. Kimura's troops were fragmented and disorganized. They had no supply dumps left. Their artillery had been abandoned. Their wounded were left by the roadside. The monsoon was still weeks away. Every day of dry weather was a day to drive forward. Slim knew that if he could take Rangoon before the rains broke, the campaign would end in one swift stroke. Rangoon was emptying. Through late April, Kimura prepared for the inevitable. He ordered his headquarters staff to burn documents and destroy radio equipment. The stores of rice and ammunition were set alight. The Japanese garrison began a general evacuation eastward, toward the Sittang River and the Thai border. For the Burmese population of the city, the departure of the Japanese was a moment of fearful uncertainty. The puppet government of Burma crumbled. Burma himself fled in the wake of the Japanese, a collaborator with nowhere left to go but into the arms of his former patrons or into the jungle. On the 3rd of May 1945, the leading elements of the British 14th Army entered Rangoon without firing a shot. The city was a ghost of its former self. The great port installations were gutted. The Syrium oil refinery had been destroyed. The streets were littered with debris. The Japanese had gone. A handful of Allied prisoners, released from the city jail, wandered through the wreckage in a daze. The Burmese population came out to watch, many of them wearing the longyi and the khaki shirts that had become the marks of survival under occupation. Rangoon had fallen twice in 3 years, first to the Japanese, now back to the British. Kimura escaped eastward with the remnants of his headquarters. His army was a shadow of the force that had conquered Burma in a few short months 3 years earlier. He would eventually make his way toward Thailand, joining other scattered Japanese units that had survived the collapse. But the battle for Burma was not quite over. One major formation remained intact, cut off and surrounded, trapped in the dense scrub-covered hills east of the Sittang. The Japanese 28th Army, commanded by General Sakurai, was still a fighting force, and it was running out of time. The Pegu Yomas were a range of low, jungle-covered hills running north-south between the main road to Mandalay and the Sittang River. In these hills, Sakurai's 28th Army had been hiding since the British advance had cut it off. Over 30,000 men, the remnants of the 54th and 55th Divisions and their supporting units, were crammed into the narrow valleys. They had no food beyond what they could scrounge from the jungle. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi were rampant. There were no medical supplies. Men died every day from starvation and disease. Sakurai knew they could not stay there indefinitely. They had to break out or die. The senior commanders debated their options. Some argued for a last stand, a banzai charge into the British lines that would kill them all but preserve their honor. Sakurai overruled them. His motto, he told his staff, was to seek life in the midst of death. He did not believe in throwing away his men's lives for nothing. He ordered a breakout. The plan was to march east through the jungle under cover of darkness, cross the Sittang River, and escape into the Karen Hills and then toward Thailand. It was a desperate gamble. The Sittang was in full flood from the monsoon. The British had fortified the West Bank, and the 28th Army was a starving, diseased ghost of itself. The British Deep Penetration Reconnaissance Teams of V-Force, a guerrilla intelligence unit, had watched the Japanese movements from jungle hides. The 17th Indian Division, which had borne the brunt of so much of the fighting, was positioned to block the main crossing points. At dawn on the 21st of July, the first Japanese columns reached the open ground near the Sittang. The British opened fire with every weapon they had. Tanks of the 255th Brigade rolled forward, their machine guns chattering, their cannons blasting the tree line. Artillery batteries dropped high explosive shells into the massed Japanese ranks. The RAF swooped low, strafing the columns with cannon and rockets. The Japanese had nowhere to hide. They had walked into a killing ground. Those who were not cut down by bullets and shrapnel scattered into the scrub, only to be hunted down by Gurkha patrols in the days that followed. The crossing of the Sittang became a slaughter. The river was high and fast-flowing from the monsoon rains. Men waded into the brown water and were swept away by the current. Others tried to swim, their emaciated bodies unable to fight the pull of the river. Some clung to improvised rafts of bamboo that came apart in the middle of the stream. The far bank was not safety. British troops and Karen guerrillas were waiting there too. Of the 30,000 men who had hidden in the Pegu Yomas, only a fraction reached the eastern bank. Perhaps 14,000 survived the crossing, and many of those were wounded or dying. The rest lay dead in the jungle, in the open ground, or at the bottom of the river. The aftermath was a landscape of horror. British soldiers who moved through the killing ground in the days following the breakout found the bodies of thousands of Japanese scattered through the scrub. The stench of death hung over the Sittang Valley. Wild dogs roamed the battlefield. The Japanese dead lay unburied, their bones bleaching in the monsoon sun and rain. It was the last major battle of the Burma Campaign. And it was, in its scale of suffering, one of the most terrible. Slim's victory was complete. The Japanese army in Burma had been annihilated. The human cost of the Burma Campaign staggered the imagination. The Japanese had sent over 300,000 men into Burma between 1941 and 1945. Over 185,000 never returned to Japan. They died in battle of disease, of starvation, or drowned in the great rivers of central Burma. The British and Commonwealth forces suffered over 73,000 casualties, of whom more than 14,000 were killed. The Indian Army, the instrument of Britain's imperial reconquest, had paid a heavy price. The Burmese people had seen their country incinerated twice over, their cities bombed to rubble, their economy shattered. In the immediate aftermath of the breakout, the Japanese High Command in Tokyo was already moving toward surrender. The Emperor's voice would be heard on the radio on the 15th of August, telling his subjects to endure the unendurable. In Burma, the remaining Japanese forces began to lay down their arms. Lieutenant General Kimura, who had escaped into Thailand, would eventually be summoned to Rangoon to hand over his sword to General Stopford at a ceremony in Judson College. The samurai sword of the Japanese commander-in-chief, the symbol of his military soul, was surrendered to a British general in the city that had been the prize of conquest and the scene of defeat. The war in Burma was over, yet even as the guns fell silent, the political struggle for the country's future was just beginning. Aung San had defected to the Allies, and his Burma National Army was now a factor in the post-war political equation. The British civil affairs officers, men with long memories of pre-war colonial rule, wanted him tried for murder. Mountbatten and Slim, the soldiers who had won the victory, saw that the old imperial certainties could not be restored. A power vacuum was opening in Burma, and into that vacuum would pour the ambitions, the hatreds, and the dreams of a people who had endured the longest war in the Asian theatre. The decisive battle at Meiktila had shattered the Japanese military machine. But the peace that followed would prove no less fragile than the jungle bridgeheads across the Irrawaddy. The war in Burma did not end with a single dramatic stroke. It dissolved over weeks of thick tropical heat. Mountbatten in Kandy received word of Tokyo's surrender on August 11th. Stopford in Rangoon, commanding the 12th Army, new organized surrender in his scattered theater would be harder than in areas where no fighting had occurred. He suspended offensive operations and told his officers to ensure Burmese guerrillas understood the ceasefire too. The jungle still held thousands of Japanese scattered in columns, many unaware their emperor had spoken. Isolated contact was inevitable. A patrol from the 17th Indian Division met a group of 8 Japanese soldiers near Nyonkasha on August 22. The Japanese offered to surrender. The next day, Captain Charles, an intelligence officer from the 63rd Brigade, kept a rendezvous and arranged for representatives of Colonel Sato's local command to meet senior British officers. The atmosphere was one of exhausted caution. Sato sent a letter that spoke in the language of a defeated but still proud army. "We have the utmost confidence in the gentlemanly behavior of the British Empire," Sato wrote. He explained that while negotiations were under discussion in Tokyo, he could only forbid movement of individuals. The Imperial Army, in accordance with His Majesty the Emperor, had forthwith ceased military operations. The words were careful, formal. They masked a deeper truth. For thousands of Japanese soldiers, surrender remained unthinkable. Many had to be found and told the war was over before they would lay down their arms. Into this confusion stepped men on their own initiative. Major John Turrell, a Force 136 officer, had been operating with guerrillas east of the Sittang River. On the evening of August 16th, before any formal channels existed, he appeared at the edge of Kanjo Force's perimeter carrying a bottle of whiskey, some food, and a white flag. He called out that the World War was over and asked to see the senior officer. The Japanese seized him at once. Colonel Furuya Sakuro, commanding Kanjo Force, was bewildered. Isolated and without radio contact with the 28th Army, he could not confirm the surrender. British planes had begun dropping leaflets in Mountbatten's name, demanding the peace envoy's return. Furuya kept Turrell under close but proper guard, ordered him fed, and had a bamboo shelter built for him. The force commander sent a staff officer to find higher headquarters. Time passed in anxious heat. Turrell, eventually sent back to the British lines under escort, escaped with his life, but never again saw the official channels he had jumped. The formal machinery of surrender ground forward at its own pace. Lieutenant General Numata, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Terauchi, flew from Saigon to Rangoon. He arrived on August 23rd, accompanied by a naval officer, a medical lieutenant, and 2 civilian interpreters. The British presented him with a blunt document. It placed full responsibility on Terauchi for ordering his forces to cease fire, for removing minefields, for banning coded signals, and for preserving order until Allied forces arrived to take over. Negotiations nearly collapsed. Numata wanted to maintain the Japanese command structure and have his troops disarm themselves. The British demanded direct disarmament under Allied control. Numata's subordinate, Colonel Tamura, whispered to him that they could only die once. Have we come all this way to be dissolved? Numata judged that the international press watching the talks would lose patience with a breakdown. The signatures were appended at 1:42 in the morning on August 28. The Rangoon Conference was merely a preliminary to the formal surrender set for Singapore on the 12th of September. The Japanese military machine in Burma formally handed over its instruments of power through weeks of ceremonial humiliation. Lieutenant General Ichida, acting for Kimura, signed the surrender of all forces under Burma Area Army at Government House in Rangoon on September 13. Kimura himself surrendered his sword to Stopford at Judson College in late October. Nearly 72,000 Japanese troops were processed as Japanese surrendered personnel by November. The Kempei, the feared military police, were behind bars. The shooting had stopped. The political reckoning began even before the ink dried on the surrender documents. The Burma National Army had defected to the Allies, and its commander, Major General Aung San, was now the most powerful figure in the country. Mountbatten and Slim had shielded him from prosecution for the murder of a village headman, overruling colonial officials who demanded a trial. The charge was never formally withdrawn, but Aung San's anti-fascist People's Freedom League held so much sway that the returning British authorities could not govern without him. The rival Yu Saw watched this rise with burning envy. He had been premier before the war and wanted that power back. On the morning of July 19, 1947, he sent 4 young gunmen armed with submachine guns into a cabinet meeting in Rangoon. They swept the room with automatic fire. Aung San was killed. 6 other ministers died on the polished floor. Yu Saw would later be tried, convicted, and executed. The father of modern Burma had become a martyr. The country, already lurching toward independence, would now plunge into the civil wars that his conciliatory voice might have averted. U Nu stood before the Constituent Assembly in Rangoon on the 24th of September 1947. He was the speaker now, the man who had inherited the leadership of the anti-fascist People's Freedom League after the assassination 10 weeks earlier. The Assembly had gathered to ratify a new federal constitution for the Union of Burma, a document hammered out in the shadow of grief and the rush toward independence. The draft included a provision for the future secession of minority states, a promise made to the Shans, the Kachins, and the Karenni. That promise was meant to hold the fractious nation together, but the ink was barely dry before the first cracks began to show. Nu had never sought power. He had been a student activist, a thakin, a dreamy Buddhist idealist who wrote plays and translated Shakespeare. Now he sat where Aung San had sat, trying to hold together a coalition of communists, socialists, and ethnic minorities who had united only to expel the Japanese and the British. The constitution was approved. The Union of Burma would come into existence on the 4th of January 1948. Outside the Assembly Hall, Rangoon was still a city of ruins, its port shattered, its refineries gutted, its people picking through the debris of war. The British prepared to leave. Sir Hubert Rani, the last governor, worked with Nu's Executive Council to transfer power smoothly, but the deep fractures in Burmese society could not be papered over by constitutional language. The communists had already broken with the AFPFL, accusing Nu of betraying the revolution. In the Irrawaddy Delta, the Karens watched the approaching independence with dread. They had been promised an autonomous state by the British. They had fought for the British. Major Hugh Seagram had given his life for them. Now they saw a Burman-dominated government that offered no guarantee of their rights. The Karens had reason to fear. The memory of the 1942 massacres in the Delta, when the Burma Independence Army had burned Karen villages and cut down fleeing families with swords, had never healed. The Japanese had encouraged that racial violence. The returning British had promised protection. Now the British were leaving, and the Karens were arming themselves. In the hill country east of the Sittang, where Seagram had walked in his rough Karen clothing, the old loyalties were hardening into defiance. On the morning of the 4th of January 1948, the Union Jack came down over Rangoon for the last time. The flag of the new republic rose over the city, a blue field with a white star, surrounded by 5 smaller stars. Burma had chosen not to join the Commonwealth. It would stand alone, the first former British colony since the American Revolution, to sever every constitutional tie. Crowds filled the streets, and for a few hours the political divisions were forgotten. U Nu spoke of a new era of peace and unity. The words were brave. They were also hollow. Within weeks, the civil war began. The Communist Party of Burma, which had fought the Japanese in the underground and supplied intelligence to Force 136, now took up arms against the government. Its red flag faction and white flag faction had different ideologies, but the same enemy, the new regime in Rangoon. In the Delta, the Karen National Defense Organization declared an independent Karen state. The army, built from the old Burma National Army, was barely large enough to hold the capital, let alone suppress multiple insurgencies across the country. The Indian Army, which had fought its way brilliantly through the Mandalay Road and into Rangoon, was gone now. It had been divided by partition as irrevocably as the subcontinent itself. The British officers who had commanded it, the men who had rebuilt the shattered Burma army in the Assam hills and led the great counter-offensive, had returned to England or taken up new posts. The sepoy who had driven his truck through the dust of the Irrawaddy Valley was now a citizen of India or Pakistan, not the Raj. The symbiosis was over. In London, Field Marshal Slim had become Chief of the Imperial General Staff, the professional head of the British Army. He had preserved the reputation of British arms in Asia, but the empire he fought to restore was evaporating, even as he took up his new office. In Delhi, Lord Mountbatten was now Viceroy of India, presiding over the bloody birth of 2 nations, the same nations whose soldiers had formed the core of his 14th Army. The Burma Campaign had been their last great shared enterprise. The memory of it was already fading into the chaos of the post-war world. The civil wars would rage for decades. The Karens held out in the hills. The communists controlled swathes of the countryside. The Kachins and Shans would later rise as well, invoking the secession clauses written into the constitution that was supposed to prevent exactly this. Burma became a battlefield, not against a foreign invader, but against itself. The countryside that had been fought over twice by British and Japanese armies was now fought over by Burmese and Karens, by communists and government troops, by ethnic militias and drug warlords. The war had settled nothing. The dead of that war lay in graves scattered across the hills from Assam to Rangoon, at Kohima, on the ridge where Colonel Laverty had been shot dead and Sergeant Waterhouse had crawled forward with a Bangalore torpedo. The British memorial bore an inscription that asked the living to remember. Its words did not speak of empire or of victory. They spoke only of sacrifice and of a debt that could never be repaid. What was that tomorrow for which so many had given their today? It was not the restored empire that Churchill had imagined. It was not the co-prosperity sphere that Barmore had proclaimed to the Greater East Asia Conference. It was not even the unified, independent Burma that Aung San had envisioned when he crossed the Irrawaddy at Alan Moyo and walked into Slim's headquarters in his Japanese general's uniform. The tomorrow that came was a fractured nation, a people divided against themselves, a war that continued by other means. The inscription at Kohima was not a boast. It was a question, and the answer was written in the graves. If you have a family story from the Burma Campaign, or a memory passed down from someone who served in that longest and most forgotten of wars, we read the comments and we would be honored to hear it. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support our future historical documentaries. Thank you for listening and for remembering them.